I want to say that we're really honored here to be joined by two guests to talk about public service and also to give us a look into the future of public service and what our keynote speaker has called a post-first world. Our discussant is Amy Dacey, who is a great friend of ours and great friend of the program. She's executive director of the Sign Institute of Policy and Politics at AU. And for more than 2 decades, Amy managed prominent national organizations, advised leading elected officials and candidates, including President Barack Obama, Senator John Kerry, and she counseled a variety of nonprofits and companies. The Sign Institute is a laboratory for university-wide collaboration and an incubator for policy innovation, convening the best and brightest in public service, private, academic, nonprofit sectors, as well as journalism. Also, Amy has a knack for finding WSP alums to be featured speakers for their programs. Just in the past year, she's had Mayor Lori Lightfoot and also former Congresswoman Barbara Comstock as her speaker. So our keynote speaker is Eric Fanning. He's President and Chief Executive Officer of the Aerospace Industries Association. Fanning joined AIA after serving as the 22nd Secretary of the Army, where he provided leadership and oversight of our nation's largest military service. He previously served as Chief of Staff to the Undersecretary of Defense, Acting Secretary of the Air Force and Undersecretary of the Air Force, Deputy Undersecretary of the Navy, Deputy Chief Management Officer, and then also as a staff member on the House Armed Services Committee, which I think is the dream of every student in our program. He's the only person to have held senior appointments in all 3 military departments and the Office of the Secretary of Defense. With his appointment as Secretary of the Army, Fanning became the highest ranking openly gay member of the Department of Defense and the first openly gay head of any service in the military. So Amy, Eric, thank you so much for joining us, giving us time out of your busy day. And Amy, take it away.
Well, thank you, everyone. I know you have an incredible program going on. We're excited to join you. I'm excited to join my friend Eric Fanning and talk about his extensive service. I think one thing we left out of his bio, which I personally think Adam is the most important, is that my dog and one of his 3 dogs are sisters. So we share that. We're raising daughters together, basically. So listen, I think, Eric, it's so good to see you. Thank you so much for joining us and taking time out of your, busy day. I think one of the things that I admire and respect so much about you is that you've seen government from a lot of different angles. It's not only public service, from your White House perch or, from Congress or, from basically every aspect of the Defense Department. So my question to you is, I know also when you were growing up, did you think, oh, that's my path, that's what I'm going to do, I'm going to get into public service, or what really led you to kind of take on all these different challenges?
No, actually, I was a STEM and an art kid growing up. And to me, the intersection of those 2 things was architecture. So I went to college to study art, to become an architect, but I chose a small school in New Hampshire and was there during the 1988 primary when the primary was open on both sides. And so there aren't a ton of places to go in New Hampshire if you're running for president. So it seemed that there was a candidate on campus every day blocking you from getting your breakfast. But it introduced me to something that I hadn't thought about, hadn't seen. It got me very excited about government, public service, politics. My freshman summer, the first summer I was there, I got a grant and came down to Washington and worked on the Hill as an intern. And that was it. I knew I wanted to come back to Washington after I graduated.
Well, it's, interesting because I think when you look at, when you started out, it was different for some people deciding to run for office. I think there's also been a lot of challenges. We've seen more and more people being vilified for serving their country or their communities. There's in some aspects, the environment has become, toxic. Social media has added a whole new level on to the challenges some people are facing as they run for elected office. I know you've also faced, challenges, just in your path, whether it was, when I think about the Army alone, one of the largest workforces in the world, like a lot of these challenges are keeping people from maybe making that leap to public service. Can you talk about how you've navigated, some of these issues and try to encourage people in the work that you're doing and have done?
Well, I think for me, there's multiple layers to that. Public service is not easy,
Yeah.
And public service is very broad. That's many different types of things. I mean, I came to Washington. I made a decision early on that I wasn't going to run for office because I knew I was gay, and I didn't think that you could combine those two things. It's a very different environment now. I ended up in the Pentagon early on in the Clinton administration. Didn't see anybody else like me, so figured there wasn't a career path for me. So that was the second time I took myself out of a path. Obviously came back and it worked out. And I think the reason is, despite all the difficulties of public service, and we could spend the rest of this time listing them, the mission beats just about anything you can think about. And the ability to make a difference. And I used to say make a difference at scale, but as I get older, I get just as much, if not more, value in making a difference one-on-one. But that's what public service for most of us is about, is making a difference, is advocating for and working on some issue to change it, to improve the lives of other people, and to advance us as a country, as a world. And that's hard to beat. That mission is really what draws a lot of people down here and allows you to kind of put up with some of the other nonsense that happens right now. I would say, there are certainly a lot of elected officials who drive me crazy, but I admire anybody who's willing to put up their hand to run for office these days. It's a grueling life. It is nonstop. And so I'd say, in a general sense, I admire those people. And for students, I always say, go to the Hill first. It is an easier place to work when you're younger. They are looking at changing conditions. The pay is terrible. The hours are grueling. And most of the jobs are relatively junior, but you get a lot of responsibility very quickly on the Hill. And if you're interested in Washington and public service, understanding the Hill will benefit you for the rest of your career. People who don't have that experience and don't understand how that branch of government works are at a disadvantage.
What do you think? I mean, you did spend some time on the Hill. That was your path. Like, what are you think some of the big lessons you learned when you were on the Hill that kind of helped guide you through the rest of your decisions? And it would be great to know some of your mentors that you met, on the Hill, who kind of helped you with that.
Well, I was lucky. This is really a sort of what a difference one person can make in your career. I took a gap year after college and just traveled, and I went back to school, and I was in the hallway talking to a professor, and another professor heard me. I'd never taken a class with this professor, and he said, "You want to go to Washington? I've got 3 names for you." One of them was dead. One of them didn't return my call, but ended up is still a very good friend and a colleague from both the Clinton and Obama Pentagons. And the third hired me into my first job and remains sort of a serious mentor figure even to this day. We get together that team. There was a 5-person team on the Armed Services Committee that still gets together now 30 years later. And when I was Secretary of the Army, one of those 5 was Secretary of the Air Force. And so those individual connections and mentoring opportunities can make an enormous difference. So I was lucky in that regard, the people that I worked for. And so, I think the lessons I learned on the Hill that are still important now that I tell people are, I always just say 2 things. Do what you're asked to do as well as you can, because that provides more opportunities. Work flows to those who do it well. You might think you're being punished rather than rewarded by getting more work, but it's important. And relationships matter. I mean, you're gonna, if you come to Washington and work in a field like national security, you're gonna run into and work with the same group of people for your career, and people remember that. The third thing that I tell people now that I think is a result of the last 5 years is work hard understanding who you are, what your values are, and what those red lines for you are, because it's rare that these ethical moral tests come in some big enormous way. They're little things you're not even noticing. And I've just watched a lot of people, particularly as of late, who just choice by choice by choice by choice get further off the line, and all of a sudden they're really lost and they didn't realize it was happening. It's really important, especially I think when you're young, because there's so many forces trying to move you in different directions, to have a sense of what you believe in, and so you can stick to that.
It's interesting though, because when you had to go back to the Hill in some of your, other positions, and there was a lot of change. There was a lot of, there's still a way to go, but there was a lot more diversity than when you first probably were working, on the Hill. And Adam mentioned actually something you said about the post-first era. It was in an interview I think you did with the Advocate. I'd love to know a little bit more about what you mean in that, in that statement, I think, especially for young people getting into this.
I think what I meant by that was eventually we break all the barriers. When in the Obama administration, when we were removing barriers to service that I and others thought were arbitrary, we would be charged with socially experimenting and creating tribes and identity politics. And what I think is what we were doing is the exact opposite. We were removing all of those labels that had nothing to do with someone's ability to serve, and just getting to the requirement. And there's something valuable about knocking down each of those barriers. So in Pete Buttigieg, we had, and this is what the article was about, I think, the interview, we had a viable LGBT presidential candidate who's now the first cabinet secretary. And that's great. And that's wonderful. We celebrate those. And I don't know that you ever get to a post-first world, because certainly there's always somebody more marginalized. We get through the door. At the end of the Obama administration, people like me, cisgender white gay men, didn't count as diversity anymore. We've done pretty well as a subgroup. But our job is also to remember there are people on the other side of the door trying to get in too. But it is nice to start knocking down some of those barriers. So it's no longer a part of the challenge for the individual, and not a surprise to people. Now, that said, I wouldn't be who I was if I didn't have that perhaps only element of me that is minority or was underrepresented, that helped forge who I am as a person. So I'm glad to have that. Someone told me that if I weren't gay, I wouldn't belong to I wouldn't be any underserved, underadvantaged. I grew up middle class, Midwestern, Protestant, white, male. And so it's a balance there. But to me, the post-first thing is we get better at the inclusion and the equity parts of this formula, not just the diversity part. And so that we are increasingly representative and bringing people in, and it doesn't become such a big story anymore.
Yeah, it's interesting because as a first yourself, I'm wondering, what kind of future do you hope young people who, are dealing with these issues themselves now as they face, public decisions whether or not to serve in public office, or there's a lot of different, as you mentioned, ways to be a public servant. Like you were never elected, but I think of all the different public service elements you had, what kind of future do you hope they face as they're making these decisions and getting involved?
Well, I think it's two things. I hope and I expect to have a future that is more inclusive. But I would also say that there is a real sense of reward and community in trying to break down barriers and open doors that were previously closed. But it is a more diverse, we have a long way to go. There's no question about it, but it is more diverse now than it was when I first came to Washington. When I was in the Clinton Pentagon, I think I moved over there when I was 24. The chairman of the House Armed Services Committee became Clinton's first defense secretary, which is why I moved over to the Pentagon. I thought I was the only gay person in the building, which mathematically is absurd when you look back on it, because there's 25,000 people in that building. And then I come back in the Obama administration, and there's a caucus of us. And the first kept changing: first confirmed person, first this, first service secretary, first whatever. And so you see the progress that's being made. But I would also say to people who don't feel that, that they're represented in what they want to do. Again, there's real reward in being a part of breaking down those barriers, but there's also more support out there than people realize. I get asked all the time by young people, and some not so young people in uniform, about coming out, because the end of Don't Ask, Don't Tell didn't mean gay people turned purple. There are a lot of people still serving in silence. And so I get this question about coming out, and I said, when you're on that side, you make a lot of decisions out of fear. What's going to be the worst case scenario? What's going to be the reaction? How many of those people are going to react that way? When you go through the experience, and in some ways I didn't really have a choice as I got more senior and went through my first confirmation process, it just became a part of the story. That's what reporters thought. They looked for a hook. That was interesting. It saved me from having to think about coming out because it got announced kind of in one fell swoop. But what I found is, there's going to be some people out there that are kind of that don't really like this idea, but they're dwarfed by the people who haven't thought about it. And you have an opportunity to turn into allies. They're further dwarfed by people that are your supporters, and you know they're going to be your supporters. And then there's this amazing silent majority, even that's just in this day and age looking for someone to throw their support to show that they're allies. And so you're giving an opportunity to this big voice of people who want to find some way to say, I support you. You're the one. You just came across my newspaper today, or you're in the office next door. And that was a real source of support for me as I went through that process, and dealt with some of the people who were not very happy to have a different service secretary than they were used to.
Yeah, I think we've got a really unique opportunity today, because you're speaking today with like faculty and administrators who have an extraordinary influence on the careers of our nation's future leaders. So what kind of advice would you give them to help students, especially students who are lacking the social capital to create career opportunities, of their own?
I think there's three things, and it can be done in very targeted ways. One is mentoring, two is networking, and three is support, access. I was a scholarship student. I couldn't have afforded to fund a summer in Washington, D.C., but I got a grant through something equivalent to Dartmouth's Sign Institute, got a grant from a different organization for another term I did down at the Carter Center. So, and there's a lot of support out there. And in fact, internships are changing. I mean, we have internships at AIA, and we pay everyone a housing stipend and a livable wage. So there are a lot of opportunities out there. Helping students access those is important. Giving them someone to talk to. Again, think of that professor who I never took a class with, who gave me 3 names, and one of them ended up setting me on this path. Really, I mean, it was one person caring enough to give me a name that mattered. And then just the networking opportunities that, like you do, Amy, at Sign, just introducing people so they can meet their peers, they can meet people that they can learn from, and then people can help shape their careers. There are a lot of people in Washington who are very happy to be asked for help and want to help because they remember the help they got.
Yeah, I think it's one of my favorite expressions is lift as you climb as well, right? You have to remember that people do have different experiences and how they need to get where they're going to go. I'm glad you mentioned the Sign Institute. As we bring in fellows, one of the questions I always ask them when they're working with students is, there's the opportunities like internships you mentioned. We try to set up student associate opportunities for them. But one thing I always ask them is, what skills do you think are really important for people, to have to develop and hone? Especially you work now at a trade association that has over close to, I think, 350 different companies. Like, what are the skill sets that young people should be developing to be relevant in the workforce if they want to go into public service? What's important?
Well, I'd go back to the 3 things I said earlier. Do everything you're asked to do as well as you can. It gets noticed. And those relationships that matter among peers you're going to be working with for your life, people that you're working for, have a sense of self. And then I think, this is a more targeted question. I'd add a 4th thing, that everything is a 2-way street. Development, communication, learning, those types of things. I sense, and maybe it's just because I'm getting older and crotchier, I don't know, that the new generation has expectations of what the workplace provides for them. And
Right.
Certainly managers, leaders are thinking about that, because workforce is a critical issue for everybody going into the future. And you have to think about how you retain a workforce. And so you want to know what your workforce wants in order to stay. And that's great, but that can't provide everything. It can't be a passive experience for the individual. And so what I tell young people is, I'm going to work as hard as I can to give you opportunities, and eventually have you need to leave this organization to find another opportunity. That's success for everybody. But you are responsible. You're your own campaign manager for the path that you take, and making those relationships, nurturing them, asking for help, seeking out those opportunities for additional skills, training, learning, and so forth. So I think that's an important thing to talk about. Find an organization that supports you, but be an active participant in that.
Well, I want to thank you. I know that I have learned a lot knowing you in my life. I think one of the other things that I think is really important to tell young people too is that you have different types of mentorship. You have the mentors who are more advanced in their career, but this peer to peer, I've gone to you with many challenges that I'm having career wise. You've helped me navigate those, and I think those are important relationships too. So I think it's one thing that we don't always emphasize with students is like your colleagues, your peers can be an incredible resource of understanding and strategic thinking too.
But Amy is my go-to coach, just so everybody knows as well. I ended up studying history instead of art. And, one of the great debates in history is, does an individual make a difference or is it movements? And I tend not to like either or questions. I'd say both most times. My career has had random, very quick inflection points because I called someone and they said, no, do this. Because part of I think I always use the analogy of driving down the highway. If you're stopped on the shoulder and you see one billboard in front of you, that's all you're going to see. If you're going at 60 miles an hour, you're going to see multiple billboards. And that's a part of signaling to people, I'm thinking about a change. I'm trying to learn about something. It puts you first and foremost in front of someone's mind. And it could just be the right moment where it just dots are connected. And that's that take an active role in your career and in your path.
Well, I know we could probably talk, I know for a fact, because we've done it before, talk all day about some of these, issues. I think it was an honor to join everybody. Adam, thank you for you and your team for allowing us to have this conversation. I encourage people, if they want their students to take advantage of some of the Sign Institute programming. Eric, I'm definitely going to have you doing more with us at Sign and talking about it. But I will just close by thanking you personally and thanking you for your service. I think you've had such a huge impact, and we all look forward to seeing what other things you're going to do in the future to really help young people have an impact on the work. And I think you're a good example too that you can work in very different ways in public service on the issues you care about and have impact. So
well, thanks for having me. It's always fun talking to Amy. And our dogs turned 2 on Sunday, and the whole litter's going to a dog park for a reunion. So
I look forward to seeing you this weekend. Right. Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you, Amy. And thank you very much, Eric, for sharing your journey, experience, and insight from the inside perspective at national level administration, and really elaborating us the value of for higher education institutions to continue to provide public service and experiential learning opportunities for the next generation leaders. I wish we have more time, but really much appreciated, and hopefully that we can invite you back many more times.